ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jacob Abrahamson, and I'm a junior McConnell Scholar here at the University of Louisville. And on behalf of the McConnell Center, it is a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. And for those of you watching from mcconnellcenter.org, thank you for joining us as well. Tonight marks the first installment of our three-part lecture series, America at the End of War. And Professor here at U of L has been instrumental in helping us get that together. So I'd like to invite up Dr. Daniel Krebs from the U of L History Department to talk a little bit about that program.
I'm not important. First of all, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Foote from Texas A&M University, for agreeing to come here. I just wanted to say a few words about what was the idea behind the series, and for that series, I would like to thank the McConnell Center for making it possible, and especially Gary Gregg, without whom I could not have organized and put this together. The idea is to show you guys, and of course folks watching on the internet, two things. First, when we're thinking about military history, often we just think about battles and moving flanks and left wing, right wing, and cavalry attacks and artillery duels and whatnot. But when you think really about military history in a little bit more of a broad sense, what you see is that warfare has been, and at least for me, will be a factor of change in American society, culture, in politics, in American life. So when we study war, we look at the changes that war brought about in the United States and in its history. So that is one idea behind looking at military history in general and doing that three-part series that you guys see the first installment today. And the second idea that I had right around the end of 2014 and then beginning 2015, the idea of looking at the end of a war. And this was the period, of course, when NATO, when the United States was pulling out of Afghanistan, at least in terms of combat forces. But at the same time, what we saw is that the war in Afghanistan, and of course, as we also know, the war in Iraq, and is not over. This is in no way, shape, or form over. Recently in the news, of course, now Russia fighting in Syria, the Syrian civil war, and emerging with the Iraqi war, the rise of ISIS, and of course lately and the Taliban attacking Kunduz there in northern Afghanistan. And I was wondering, what is it about the end of war? And we seem to be so surprised when thinking about the end of war and the end of Iraq and Afghanistan, how it is not really an end. And what I saw when looking at American military history is I saw that this is not the first time that this happened. That we in the United States, we declare dates and we declare the war is over. And when we look a little bit closer, that kind of end date becomes a little shaky. When you think about World War I, for example, in 1918 as this end of World War I, and in reality what you see is a civil war in Russia. What you see is essentially a civil war in Germany. What you see is violence in the Middle East. So very much not a war that is over. After World War II, similar situation. You have 1945, but then you have the Cold War. You have, again, war in the Middle East. So you have millions of displaced persons in Europe. And that led me to think about, let's discuss a little bit the end of war and what happens at the end of the fighting. Is that war over? What is going on there, and explore that a little bit. And this is when I invited then Dr. Foote as the first speaker here to talk about the end of the Civil War and what is going on, and she's going to look at it from a very interesting angle, and I'm not going to say anything else. But that's just from me to introduce this series, to thank you for coming, to thank the McConnell Center for making it possible, and I'm sure that you guys are going to learn and enjoy what these fabulous historians have to tell us. And the first installment, as I said, today. But first, I think Jacob is back up again. There he is. Thank you.
Lorien Foote is professor of history at Texas A&M University. She is the author of 2 books, most recently, The Gentleman and the Roughs, Manhood, Honor, and Violence in the Union Army, which was a finalist and honorable mention for the 2011 Lincoln Prize. Her next book, The Yankee Plague, Escaped Prisoners of War and the Collapse of the Confederacy, will be published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2016. Foote is the creator and principal investigator of a project with the Center for Virtual History at the University of Georgia that is creating animated maps showing the movement of 3,000 U.S. prisoners of war out of the Confederacy in the winter of 1864 to 1865. So please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Lorien Foote.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to thank Dr. Krebs and the McConnell Center for a wonderful reception. I really enjoyed my time here, and all of the McConnell scholars for a very interesting discussion this afternoon. So what I'd like to do this evening is tell you 3 stories. One story about the attempt of the United States of America to recover 10,000 prisoners of war from the Confederate States in the middle of an active military campaign, and what that tells us about the chaos and the inability to plan how wars end and the end of war. Then I'd like to tell you the story of a prisoner of war and his journey home, to show how for prisoners of war, the process of ending war is a very long one. And then finally, I'd like to tell you a third story about the last escape from a Confederate prison, which occurred in January of 1866. Now, some of you may be saying, but wait, the war ended in April 1865. But see, you're going to be so wrong. And that's what you will learn at the very end of my talk, when the war actually ended. So I want to start with this first story. And to do this, I want to just kind of remind you of something about the end of war. We're going to be talking about prisoners of war and trying to get your prisoners of war back and exchanging prisoners of war at the end of a war. But when we're dealing with the end of war, the losing belligerent, the losing side, is experiencing the collapse of its military, economic, and social functions. It's collapsing. The winning belligerent is experiencing the unfolding of events in a timing and a schedule that they didn't necessarily plan for. And those 2 situations merge to create humanitarian disasters in many ways at the end of almost every war. And this occurs at the end of the American Civil War. And it occurs when the Confederacy is going to try to bring 10,000 prisoners of war from South Carolina and North Carolina and deliver them to United States authorities at Wilmington, North Carolina, in the middle of a military campaign that is ending the war. So let's talk about this interesting moment in the Civil War. And to do that, I'm going to put up a map here. So we're going to enter into this story in February of 1865. And the context is that William Tecumseh Sherman and his Federal Army has finished their march to the sea and captured Savannah. And Sherman, by this point, is well into his invasion of South Carolina. Meantime, there is also a Union, I think I have a little red thing here. Yes, there it is. Meantime, the Union Army is also conducting a campaign against Wilmington, which is the last Confederate port that's still open to blockade runners. And the United States Army is going to capture in a joint operation with the Navy Fort Fisher, which guards this Cape Fear River that leads up to Wilmington. Well, in this situation, there are also prisoners of war, because by February 1865, the Confederacy has 3 major prison camps in South Carolina and North Carolina. And there's more prison camps in the state than those 3, but 3 major prison camps. There's one for officers here at Columbia. There is one for enlisted men here in Florence, and there's another prison for enlisted men at Salisbury, North Carolina. So there are roughly 20,000 United States prisoners of war in these 2 states in February of 1865. Well, in February, the United States is desperate to get its prisoners of war, to start that process of getting them back. So Ulysses S. Grant, who is the commander-in-chief for the Union armies, he agrees to an exchange of prisoners in the Carolinas. It's not a general exchange of prisoners, but he agrees that the United States will return some of the Confederate prisoners that it holds in the North in exchange for all of the prisoners of war in South Carolina and North Carolina. So great. The Confederate States of America is going to agree to take its prisoners, and they're going to deliver the prisoners at Columbia, at Florence, and at Salisbury to Wilmington. Okay? But the Confederacy is having to do this while also trying to defend from Sherman's invasion and also from the attacks on Wilmington. And what happens next reveals the breakdown that goes on at the end of war. Okay? The day before Sherman and his forces capture Columbia, the Confederate guards at the prison camp there get the prisoners out of the camp, march them to the train station. Nobody's in charge in Columbia anymore. It's total chaos in the city. The state government officials are trying to flee out of the way of Sherman's army. The Confederate army is burning things before they're trying to leave. Everybody's trying to get on trains when there is no train schedule anymore and nobody's really in charge of the trains. So these prisoners of war are being put on trains that are supposed to be used to evacuate military stores from the city of Columbia. People are trying to get on the trains. It's complete chaos. And hundreds of prisoners are going to escape during that process. In the meantime, the prisoners, these enlisted men who have been held in Florence, the railroad has been cut. So the Confederacy is going to march about 7,000 prisoners of war by foot from Florence to Charlotte, North Carolina. Okay? About 1,700 of them escape on the march. And those that don't, that's because pretty much they're ill from malnourishment and exposure. The prisoners at Salisbury are going to kind of hold on there and they're going to wait. Okay? So these prisoners, they march, they get on trains, and you can see, forget the fugitive travel zones. That's for something else, for a different talk, I guess. Anyway, but you can see here's kind of the rail lines. So these prisoners from Columbia and Florence, they're going to end up at Charlotte, and then they're going to be taken by train to supposedly to Wilmington. Well, here's the problem. In the chaos or fog of war, especially when we're at the end and bureaucracies are breaking down in the nation that's losing like is happening in the Confederacy, nobody in the Confederate government informed the Confederate generals who were defending Wilmington that 8,000 prisoners of war were about to show up in their lines. Okay? And in fact, even on the U.S. side, the side that's doing well, nobody had told the federal officers conducting the campaign against Wilmington that U.S. prisoners of war were on their way to be turned over to U.S. authorities. So you have somebody defending a city, somebody attacking a city, and neither of them are aware that there's about to be train loads of prisoners of war showing up on the scene. Okay? So the first batch from Charlotte takes the train. The trains are so broken down in the Confederacy that by this point that they're going about 8 miles an hour. The trains are going about 8 miles an hour. They go down this route, Greensboro, Raleigh, Goldsboro. Then they go down to Wilmington. So the first batch of about 2,500 prisoners arrives just as the Confederate General Robert Hoke, who is commanding the city, decides that he's having to evacuate his garrison. So he was about to try to put his garrison on the trains to get out of the city. And now instead, the railroad lines are taken up by carloads of 2,500 prisoners. And he gets the news that another 6,000 are on their way in the next 48 hours. Okay? So he sends a message to some of his commanders saying, we've got to hold on longer. And he says, send these prisoners back. I've got to have these rail lines. I've got to have the cars to evacuate our military stores. So the prisoners are put back on the train, and they head back out of Wilmington. For some reason, I can't see my little red thing. Anyway, they're taken out of Wilmington back towards Goldsboro. They run into the trainload of people who are following them that think they're on the way to Wilmington. And they all end up between Greensboro and Goldsboro, and they get turned out into open fields outside the city, outside these three cities. So what you want to picture is right along the railroad lines, there's about 10,000 prisoners of war with no shelter, just camping out outside these cities. And several hundred of them are seriously ill, near the point of death. Some of them are going to die during this process of transfer back and forth. So they're just turned out in open fields. Now, by this point, some of the prison guards say to themselves, this is clearly a sign that we have lost this war, and so I'm just leaving. So we know that a lot of the prison guards just kind of melt away. At this point, more of the prisoners escape. They figure, I can walk to Wilmington faster than it's clear I'm going to get there on these trains. So there's also going to be then this just kind of chaotic refugee issue as men are just leaving, the guards and the prisoners, wandering through the countryside, stealing people's food, sleeping in people's barns, deciding, hey, that looks like a nice hayloft. Oh, there's some good, so for the citizens living in this area, they've got escaped prisoners of war and former prison guards moving across their land, eating freely, sleeping in their barns, okay? So it's complete chaos along these railroad lines in February and March. Okay, so the Confederate general, as these prisoners are hanging around back here, he's facing a federal advance against the city. He evacuates his garrison. So now the federal army marches successfully and triumphantly into Wilmington. Along the way, scooping up some of the prisoners of war that first 2,500 who initially got to Wilmington. Some of them had escaped when they got there and just kind of hid in places waiting for the Union Army to come to Wilmington and liberate them. So the federal army captures the city of Wilmington, but then here's the problem for them. They're about to try to occupy and stabilize an enemy city, right? With a hostile population. So the federal commander gets a message from the Confederate commander. I want you to know that your prisoners of war are behind our lines. They're dying at a heavy rate because we don't have shelter and food for them. I have got to give you these prisoners. So the federal commander says, okay, he has to call a halt to his active military operations for a week and a half to receive all of the prisoners that are going to be exchanged. So from the end of February until about March 5th, the United States officials at Wilmington will receive about 2,000 prisoners a day for that time period, as they're trying to occupy and stabilize the city. Well, when these prisoners arrive, most of them have been in Confederate prison camps for between 12 to 24 months. So most of them are at some level of illness because of malnourishment, lack of exercise, exposure, things like that. So they're not in good shape. And there's a real sanitary and medical crisis because suddenly you're going to have 10,000 of these guys, these former prisoners of war, eventually accumulate in Wilmington. So this federal commander is trying to stabilize a hostile city. He's trying to deal with the end of slavery. And he's trying to deal with suddenly taking care of these prisoners that he was not prepared to take care of. So what he has to do is go to the citizens of Wilmington, the people that he's trying to successfully occupy, and say, can we put some typhoid patients in your house? We've got some guys who are dying here. Do you mind if they stay in your bedroom? So what the Union Army is going to do is it's going to put, because 8,000 prisoners of war, that's a lot. So they have to put them in warehouses, they have to put them in people's homes. They're going to end up laying around on the streets. They're going to end up in the wharves. They're going to cover the city. Well, an epidemic breaks out in Wilmington. So the problem for federal military commanders is one of the goals of this Wilmington operation. Besides closing the port to blockade runners, besides, capturing this important Confederate city, they were supposed to serve as a supply base for William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was marching up from South Carolina. He'd been cut off from a supply base since he left Savannah. He was supposed to get supplies from Wilmington so that then he could move up into Virginia behind Robert E. Lee, and Grant was going to be on one side of Robert E. Lee, and Sherman was going to come up on the rear. But that now can't happen on the right timetable because they had to give all of the shoes and blankets and clothes that were intended for Sherman's army to all of these prisoners of war laying around the city of Wilmington. Okay? So when Sherman invades North Carolina, he sends a message to Wilmington. I'm here, I'm ready for my supplies. And he gets a message back, I can't get them for you because I've had to give them to these prisoners of war. So ultimately, having to take care of all of these prisoners of war not only delays Sherman, his advance in North Carolina, but it also delays the advance of the Union Army out of Wilmington to meet up with Sherman, and it destabilizes the United States occupation of Wilmington. So the problem of processing and handling exchanged prisoners of war as active military operations are unfolding was really a problem for ending the war successfully. Okay? So that's my first story. Now I have to take a little sip of water. My second story is about these prisoners that come to Wilmington, because I think looking at this story personally helps us understand something about the process of ending war for the prisoners who lived through it and how long that transition can be. So the McConnell scholars and some of the teachers I'm going to be talking with later, oh no, this is not going backwards, oh there we go. I had them read an excerpt from a published memoir based on a diary of one of these prisoners of war named Benjamin Booth. And Booth had been captured in October of 1864. First, he went to Libby Prison in Richmond, and then, like many other prisoners of war, he ends up in Salisbury Prison, or Salisbury Prison. I never know, I never say it right. Anyway, he kept a diary during his time there, and this prison actually had the highest death rate of any Confederate prison. Everyone's heard of Andersonville, but this prison actually had a higher death rate of its inmates. So he experiences this trip from the perspective of these prisoners from this North Carolina prison camp. And what happens to him is very interesting, because these prisoners first, they get marched to Goldsboro, then they take an 8-mile-an-hour train and they get to Wilmington, because they don't leave until after the United States has halted its military operations and started receiving the prisoners. But he arrives, and when he gets there to the exchange point, he's marched by in a line to the Union Army lines, to the Federal Army lines. And these Federal soldiers, they know that their comrades who have been prisoners of war are about to arrive. So these Federal soldiers have made signs that say, "Welcome home, our brothers." They have military bands that are playing patriotic songs as these prisoners of war march through the first line of Federal troops. And then these regiments for the Union Army that are awaiting to receive these prisoners, they've also made for them coffee, eggs, built up all these rations, and they just have this cornucopia of food that they just can't wait to shower on all these prisoners of war. So I think all of us today understand the problem that when you take people who are malnourished and in some cases actually have reached the physical level of starvation, which some of the Salisbury prisoners had done, that the worst thing in the world you can do is give these guys a cornucopia banquet of food. But that's what's going to happen. These guys, and of course they're famished, they see all this, and they just start stuffing themselves. Before they even kind of get to where they're supposed to get, they just take a break and start eating. And the account that I had them read, the guy says, "I got drunk on coffee. I drank so much coffee that I was positively and helplessly drunk." Okay. Well, now, as this is happening, some of the medical surgeons for the Union Army hear about this. Because again, nobody had been prepared for the arrival of these prisoners. It happened at a time and a place they weren't expecting. And so there wasn't some kind of medical system in place to help them. So, the surgeons hear about this. Do you realize some prisoners of war are arriving and that they are stuffing themselves with food? So they have to run down to these points and say, okay, stop giving them food, and we have to set up kind of a system of issuing regular rations for them. Okay? So Booth finally gets his way into the city of Wilmington. He'll sleep on the wharves one night, but he's going to be just fed constantly by all these well-meaning United States soldiers who are so happy to see a prisoner of war that they can help and give him some food. So he's going to just eat a lot during his stay in Wilmington, which happens to many of these prisoners of war. Okay? So then they're going to be put on a steamer, and they're going to be taken to Camp Parole, Maryland, which was a processing station for prisoners of war who had been released from captivity in the Confederacy. And here's kind of a sketch of what Camp Parole looked like. So the first problem, and I'm sorry that I have to give this lecture before a lot of you eat dinner, or I'm sorry before a lot of you have already eaten dinner that you have to hear this lecture. But they're going to put all these prisoners of war who've just engorged themselves eating food when their stomachs were not able to handle it, they're going to put them on a ship. Do you see where I'm going with this? Okay. The seasickness level everybody started vomiting. I mean, Booth said that, he felt like things were coming out of his feet. And he even uses a wonderful phrase, I vomited till I was as empty as a Salisbury meal sack. I'm just complete. So they're horribly seasick. And again, we're going to see the consequences of this will last for the rest of his life. So that they're all just horribly ill by the time they get to Camp Parole. So once they're here, the U.S. authorities kind of have a system to get these guys cleaned up and get them back into shape as normal citizens again. So what happens is, once they get to Camp Parole, they have to strip off all of their clothes that they were wearing while they were in prison, which are then, of course, burned. And then they go through an assembly line for cleanliness that's manned by what Booth describes, and other prisoners who went through this also describe as very strong, muscular men who are in charge of this assembly line. These muscular men bathe them, give them really good scrub downs. Then they get their head shaved to get rid of the lice. Okay? Then they get toweled off and dried, and then they get issued a new set of clothes. And then they get 25 cents a day for every day they spent in a Confederate prison. The U.S. government had decided, since these guys weren't issued their U.S. Army rations while they were in prison, they deserve back pay for their U.S. Army rations. So we'll give them 25 cents a day. So they get their check. And most of the men who go through this process, they felt like getting clean and getting their head shaved and the lice removed and getting a clean set of clothes. They felt like men again. One of the McConnell scholars this afternoon, I liked this very much, said it was like they felt like animals before, and now they felt like men again. And that's very much what we see in these accounts. So then they're going to get on U.S. military transportation on trains to take them back home. So by now it's kind of middle to the end of March 1865. So the U.S. government will take them on trains to the major cities. So they can go to Columbus, they can go to St. Louis, they can go to Des Moines. Benjamin Booth was an Iowan. So he's going to get to Des Moines. But once he gets there, the government does not provide any transportation for him to actually get from that stop to his home. So his farm was 25 miles from Des Moines, Iowa. By the time he gets to Des Moines, after his vomiting session on the steamship, he hasn't been able to eat basically since he got to Camp Parole. He can't keep anything down. And by the time he gets to Des Moines, he hasn't eaten for about 48 hours. So he and one of his comrades have to hire a wagon to take them to their farm. And what happens is he becomes so sick that they just have to stop at a farmhouse and ask the family, and the family's going to feed them, if they can get food, if they can stop for the night. He's so sick. He ends up being unable to leave the house on his own. His comrade has to go and get his wife. His wife and brother-in-law have to come and get him, put him in the wagon, and take him back to the farm. He gets back to his farm in March. He's delirious for about, I can't remember, he said 3 or 4 weeks. Can't recognize his wife, completely delirious. He's not well enough to write in his diary about the end of his journey until December of 1865. So for Benjamin Booth, the process of transitioning out of the war right, is something that takes him from March until December 1865, but really longer. Because like most prisoners of war, it's going to take him about 2 years to be able to eat normally again. And all of the prisoners of war have the same concept, the same comment about their experience. I was hungry all the time. And even once their stomachs are able to keep down food, no matter how much I ate, I was still hungry. And that just lasts for about 2 years, this incessant, unquenchable hunger. So for these prisoners of war, the war obviously doesn't end for Benjamin Booth in March of 1865. And it's still mentally played out in his head in the 1880s when he publishes his memoir as a statement he still thinks it's important to make about his view that the rebels purposely starved and mistreated him. He still wants that point made very clear in the 1880s. So for prisoners of war, their memories and the meaning of the war is something that lasts for decades. And this is true on the Confederate side as well. So that's my second story. My third story is about the escape of prisoners of war at the end of the Civil War. So I've talked about this exchange of prisoners in March of 1865 and Benjamin Booth's journey. One of the things that's interesting is in April and May, after Robert E. Lee surrenders to U.S. Grant, after Joe Johnson surrenders to Sherman in North Carolina, the U.S. Army is going to send cavalry units around different southern states to try to find small prison camps where U.S. prisoners of war might still be held. In April and May, the Confederacy is going to deliver prisoners of war from bigger camps to points like Vicksburg, Mississippi. But there's smaller camps where, 100 people might have been held. So the cavalry is going to move through these southern states trying to find these minor camps. Because what happened is, at most of these little camps, the Confederate prison guards hear the rumor that some major army commander has surrendered, and they just leave and they don't tell the prisoners the war is over. So in May, the U.S. cavalry is still going to find U.S. prisoners of war in little stockades in Georgia, in Alabama, in Mississippi, and in Texas. But what's even more interesting to me is how many prisoners escaped from Confederate prison camps throughout the rest of 1865. So before we look specifically at these numbers, which you're already looking at, which you should, because when you have a PowerPoint slide, you have to look at it. But I want to say something about how I found these numbers, because this is one of those lucky moments as a historian that it almost seems like something in fiction. I found a record set that had been misplaced in the National Archives. So nobody had really looked at it before. And what it was a list that federal clerks had made in the 1880s. So what happens by the 1880s, there's all this debate in the United States about giving pensions to veterans. And people were applying for pensions and they had to prove they were a veteran. Well, some of the prisoners, and they had to prove that their disability came because of their service, right? Well, prisoners of war want to get a pension because they're all still sick. And they know that they were disabled because they were a prisoner of war, but they don't often have proof that they were, especially for some of them who had escaped. So what happens is the federal government is actually going to create a bevy of clerks whose job is going to be to try to find and prove some of these men were prisoners of war who escaped, right? Because they're not processed through the exchange. They're not officially handed over. They escaped. So they created a list. On this list, there were 3,000 names. And I've been going through and kind of verifying their status and dealing with this list. But what's very interesting to me is that when we look at the data, when some of these escapes occurred and where. So from September 1864 to 1865, there's 2,500 escapes from Confederate prisons. And almost all of these escapes occur in South Carolina. Those escapes are very straightforward in why they happened. The Confederacy had two important prison camps in Georgia, one at Andersonville that we've all heard of, and then one at Macon, which was the officers' prison. When Sherman captures Atlanta in September of 1864, the Confederacy has to get these prisoners out of Georgia because they don't want Sherman to liberate these prisoners. So they move them into South Carolina. South Carolina had no place prepared to house these prisoners. So the officers who get moved from Macon, Georgia to Columbia, South Carolina, they get turned out literally in an open field with no fence and no buildings and a couple of cannon to guard them. About half of them immediately escaped. Okay? So most of these 2,500 escapes are during that transfer from Georgia to South Carolina. And it's kind of one of the signs that the Confederacy is collapsing, right? Its territory is collapsing. It doesn't have any place to move prisoners of war that isn't under threat from federal armies. And so there's going to be these mass escapes during this chaos. But what's interesting to me is that there's these isolated escapes after May of 1865. So there's still Confederate armies that haven't surrendered in Texas in May of 1865. These armies will surrender in May. The last official army surrender of the Civil War is in June of 1865 in Indian Territory. A Cherokee Indian General Stand Watie will surrender in June. Okay? But when I look at this list, there were 239 U.S. soldiers that escaped from places where they were held in the Confederacy in May. There were 10 escapes in June of 1865. In August, there's one escape. This is a guy who had been held in Indian Territory, just in kind of a little county jail. If we'll think of it like it was a county jail. He escapes. In September of 1865, there were 4 escapes. But then it gets really interesting if we trace out the next. I don't know why this isn't moving. There we go. Oh, no. Okay. In October of 1865, 3 sailors from the Union Navy escaped from the vicinity of Camp Ford, Texas. That was one of the prison camps in Texas, and it had actually been shut down earlier, so it's the vicinity of and not Camp Ford. But the most interesting one to me that I want to just kind of use to discuss the end of war a little bit is January 1866. And this is when Corporal Henry Scott of the 44th U.S. Colored Troops showed up at the camp of the 1st Iowa Cavalry stationed in Sherman, Texas. Okay. Scott is one of 32 men from his regiment who escaped from Confederate prison. And I'm going to do the annoying air quote thing, but we've got to use air quotes because here's what's interesting. The 44th U.S. Colored Troops, the entire regiment was taken captive. It was surrounded at Dalton, Georgia in October of 1864, and its colonel surrendered the regiment. Now, this is a U.S. Colored Troop regiment. And at this point, the Confederate government had a policy that U.S. colored troops that were captured, if they had been slaves, they would be returned to slavery. So these U.S. colored troops, not all of them were from the 44th, but a good chunk of the men from the regiment are returned to slavery. And I have found men from the 44th U.S. colored troops that were returned to slavery that end up in North Carolina, in Georgia, in Virginia, and in Texas. Okay? 31 of them escaped from slavery. And it's really funny because in this database, the clerks, when they were trying to compile this information, what they had was where captured, where imprisoned, the date they escaped, where they escaped to, and the date they arrived where they escaped to. Well, for the men from the 44th U.S. Colored Troop, what they put in where they escaped from, they put rebel plantation, okay, which I think is really interesting, indicating these guys escaped from slavery. So Corporal Henry Scott of the 44th U.S. Colored Troop, he escaped from the plantation where he was still being held as a slave in January of 1866. Now, supposedly, this is 6 months after what in Texas is celebrated as Juneteenth, right, the end of slavery. So this is the moment where some of you may be saying, wait a minute, January 1866, the war is over. by then. But see, no, it's not. It's not officially over. I don't know why I'm having trouble with this. Here we go. Because the official date at the end of the Civil War is not in April of 1865 when Robert E. Lee surrenders, or even in May of 1865 when the army in Texas is surrendered. This is one suggested official date for the end of the war. It could be August 20th, 1866, when there is a presidential proclamation by President Andrew Johnson entitled Proclamation Declaring that Peace, Order, Tranquility, and Civil Authority now exist and throughout the whole of the United States of America. And then here's what the proclamation says. The insurrection, which heretofore existed in the state of Texas, is at an end and is to be henceforth so regarded in that state as in the other states before named, in which the said insurrection was proclaimed to be at an end by the aforesaid proclamation of the 2nd day of April, 1866. Right? So Johnson declares that the insurrection is over in every state but Texas in April of 1866. And then in August of 1866, he proclaims now that the insurrection is an end in Texas. And I do further proclaim that the said insurrection is at an end and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exist in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. Okay? But there's a reason that Johnson is issuing this proclamation. It's because there are Republican members of Congress in 1866, in August, who are saying the war is not over. There are still guerrillas in major portions of the former Confederate states. There's still violence that's going on. We have parts of North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, and Tennessee in which there is absolutely no law and order. There is a security vacuum, isn't that the current terminology? There's a security vacuum in significant portions of these former Confederate states. So we need to have a strong congressional reconstruction to occupy these insurrectionary states. Johnson has a different plan than Congress, and that's one reason he wants to go ahead and declare it's over. But notice he doesn't do that until August of 1866, in the face of people of Congress saying the war still isn't over. So when I say the United States recovered its last prisoner of war in January of 1866, that prisoner of war was recovered before the war was officially over. But it throws off our whole thinking about the Civil War if we understand that officially it wasn't over when we think of the surrender at Appomattox. Okay? And I think looking at prisoners of war is a way of understanding that the end of war cannot always be precisely defined. And we see that through this story. So I told you my 3 stories, and I always like to leave lots of time for questions. And so I will now like to open the floor if there are any questions for me.
I would like to ask, what was the need for the different prison camps for the officers and the
Now that's a great question, because officers are gentlemen, and enlisted men are not. And they must be treated differently. Officers get different punishments than enlisted men for the same crime. Of course, officers can be tried under the charge conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, which an enlisted man could not. So something that you can execute an enlisted man for, an officer would just get kicked out of the army. But that is such an eternal stain on his gentlemanly reputation that it's as devastating as if you executed him. And I mean, I'm answering you in kind of a joke, but I mean, the answer is, in the mid-19th century, they still followed some of the formal civilized rules of war that made a strong distinction between officers and enlisted men. And, you know, officers' bodies are recovered for burial. Enlisted men are put in mass graves. I mean, there's just a vast difference in their treatment. And the same is true in prison of war camps. Officers could have access to extra money to supplement their rations. So death rates are higher in the camps for enlisted men than officers, because officers have money that they can purchase food from citizens, and that enlisted men don't always have access to. So, yes, sir?
The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all the slaves?
No. Yeah, I mean, it only applies in places where the Union Army wait, I'm going to say this wrong because I'm tired. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to states, to places that were still in rebellion at the time the proclamation went into effect. But it's going to take a while. The way the proclamation is worded, anywhere that the Union Army goes after the proclamation goes into effect, it is the obligation of the Army to liberate slaves. So at the end of the Civil War, the Secretary of War has to write a report about how many slaves the Union Army liberated under the Emancipation Proclamation. And the report says 200,000. But obviously, that's only in places where the Union Army goes. And that's part of what we forget about the Civil War is despite the widespread invasions, I mean, there are a significant number of southern counties that never see the presence of a U.S. soldier. And it's going to take a long time for slavery there to end. And I mean, that's what we see in Texas. I mean, it takes a long time for the last slave to have anything like knowledge even that there's been liberation in Texas. To get to those frontier places and make those kind of announcements takes a while. Yes, ma'am?
What do we know about the release of Confederate prisoners?
Right. So it's actually fairly chaotic as well, because what's going to happen is, so when we deal with the exchange in March, the Union Army is going to take Confederate prisoners from some of the northern prison camps, an equal number of them, and they're going to be taken by steamer to a point near Savannah. And so then those guys are going to be turned over to Confederate authorities. The difference for these Confederate prisoners is they're not going to have official transportation home. So like Benjamin Booth, he at least got the train ride to Des Moines. These guys, a lot of them are going to have to walk from Savannah to Tennessee, for example. Okay. Then at the very end of the war, after we get the May surrenders, the Union Army is going to open up its prison camps. I mean, most of them had already been released by May, but any remaining prisoners, they're going to be allowed to go, but they don't get any official transportation. So, I mean, we have stories of guys who, walk from some of the prison camps in northern Illinois to Alabama. I mean, they have to walk home. And there's a really interesting, a Tennessee historian, there's a Tennessee Civil War Veterans questionnaire that was passed out that actually one of the questions that the state of Tennessee asked its Civil War veterans was, how did you get home? And that is a really interesting section to read the answers, because it's a lot of discussion about how I walked 700 miles. But I mean, that's the same for the soldiers in the Army too. I mean, Lee's Army, they walk home. And there's a wonderful book that talks about the importance of the movement of soldiers at the beginning of the Confederacy to show we're a new nation, because all these small communities have Confederate soldiers coming through on train or marching through, and they're in their uniforms, and it's kind of this tangible symbol of we're this new nation. And then the equal symbol, of thousands and thousands of poorly clad men walking home from the war, clogging the roads, stopping and begging for food. I mean, there's this wonderful diary of a woman in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and she talks about every day she's feeding 20 to 50 Confederate soldiers walking home from Virginia. And I mean, she has hardly anything, but I mean, they're coming to her, and of course, she's a patriot for the Confederacy. She wants to feed every one of these guys, so she's giving them the food that she would have been feeding her kids. So yeah, I mean, on neither side do we see this nice, neat, we're going to help these prisoners of war get home. Other questions? Yes, sir.
In your research of prisoners, have you uncovered much conversation, correspondence dealing with the prisoner's faith and how talking about change, the experience of war, experience of being in a prison camp changes their faith?
Okay, I'm really glad you asked that question, because there's this big debate among historians, and I fall very strongly on one side, and so now I get to give the answer I want to give instead of what some other Civil War historians would give, okay? So there are some historians who look at prisoners of war diary and think that they see kind of a despair and a sense of hopelessness kick in, and where is God in all this, okay? There are men for whom that happened, okay? But I fall into the camp of the historians who say their faith sustained them, and that what we see, and part of this is because of a big difference between 19th century culture and our culture. 19th century culture celebrates and elevates suffering. Suffering is noble. Suffering shows your character. Suffering is not something to be avoided. It is something to be embraced. And they believe that in a way that we don't anymore. And there's a lot of historians who compare prisoners of war in the Civil War within World War I. In World War I, you see the kind of cynical hopelessness, cynicism. You see some of that, I'm not denying, you see some of that at the end of the Civil War. It's the transition phase to modernity, right? But I see a real hanging on to that sense of what I went through was horrible, but it has incredible meaning. It has incredible meaning for my faith. It tested my faith in God, and I passed. It tested my devotion to my cause, and I passed. And by suffering for my cause, I helped my cause. And so I think they managed some of the aftermath of being a prisoner of war better in some ways than modern prisoners of war. And I'm willing to say that's controversial, but because they had such a different cultural understanding of suffering. So the lens is very different. Yes?
Just relating it to another book, I believe it's called Republic of Suffering.
Yes.
In which the author makes the point that the scale of things that have been going on in terms of death and the way that the nation dealt with that changed the way that the federal government had dealt with cemeteries and things like that. The way that the federal government's dealing with Union prisoners here, do you see that as something that's kind of along the same lines, as part of the same process?
It is, especially at some, I used this example this afternoon, but one of the things that happens is immediately after the liberation of Andersonville, the most famous of the Confederate prison camps, federal authorities go in and they want to create this, they want to rebury the dead from Andersonville and create this new cemetery. And I think she does talk about that in this Republic of Suffering. But I think dealing with prisoner of war deaths and creating cemeteries and creating ways to memorialize their deaths is a very important part of that process. But actually, and I got to throw this in since one of the things that's interesting, there's a lot of people who look at prisoners of war that actually say, like everything else in Gilded Age America, prisoners of war also become commercialized. Because one of the things that happens is one of the former inmates of one of the most famous Confederate prisons, Libby Prison in Richmond, he pays to have the whole building moved to Chicago and turned into a museum where people can come and go through this Libby Prison Museum and then also buy and purchase little prisoner of war artifacts because he chops up some of the stockade that surrounded Andersonville. And so you could, for, I can't remember how much it is, 50 cents, you could buy a part of the Andersonville stockade, and thousands of people come and buy this. So, some people would say we can't ignore the commercialization of everything about America by the 1880s and 1890s, and prisoners of war become part of that too.
You made a comment early in your comments about the North was not prepared. And, I always think of my mother that, we reread Gone with the Wind at least once a year. And she would just always cuss about Lincoln and say he just did such a terrible job in managing the war, and said, why did, and her point was, why did he go ahead and get things taken care of? And but I guess I was asking your comment, how well was the North not only prepared for the war, but how were they prepared for victory? It's, when you seems like,
No, that's a great question. I mean,
when you get a war that gives you the Gilded Era, it gives you the failed policy of Reconstruction, which didn't free the slaves. The only people that came out on top of that were the people that were up in the North selling cotton.
So anyone in here who is a veteran can feel free to jump in on my answer. I have one of my doctoral students, I'm Lieutenant Colonel back there, especially after our, one of my doctoral students is a career Army officer he finished his MA with me last spring, and he's now at West Point, and he's doing his dissertation on occupation. And when he first came and was talking to me about his dissertation topic, he said, he served in Iraq. He said, it just seems to me from my study of history that we never do the right thing to prepare for what happens when we win. We never have the plan that fits. We never, and I mean, the answer in the Civil War is there was absolutely no initial strategic plan about what happens if we win. How do we occupy? I mean, there wasn't good planning. So, I mean, that's the simple answer. And it seems to be a long-standing problem. There's a historian who writes about American POW policy throughout American history. He traces it back from the colonial period up through the present. And I mean, he argues that that's part of the problem with prisoner of war policy in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that the military doesn't do enough planning about what are we going to do with prisoners of war, how are we going to handle that, who's going to guard them, how do we plan for the contingency that there's mass surrenders. You know, I mean, so I think a lot of this is not well planned. And we talked about this earlier.
Yeah, I'd say openly, I think it's a whole government approach too, because you're always planning, hey, let's score the touchdown. Once the touchdown's scored, what do we do then? And just field goal, whatever you might look at. But if you look at, you know, everyone thinks, hey, Department of State's going to come in, they're going to help establish governments and all that. And quite frankly, it probably takes at least 50% more to just maintain after, you know, when you start reconstruction than it does to kick that field goal or that touchdown. So.
And I'll get to your question. Well, I also just want to say this. There's a wonderful new book out called After Appomattox that deals with the immediate aftermath of the war and where the Army had stationed troops in the South and where they were and what they were doing. And I mean, one of the things that book and the other literature that I've seen on it, the U.S. Army actually had a really good and effective demobilization plan for the end of the war. I mean, these are volunteers for the most part. There had been a conscription, a lot of draftees were in the Army, but I mean, the goal of the United States when the war is over is to get these guys back to the home front. And it's amazing how quickly and effectively the Union Army demobilizes, but that was the problem. They had a plan for demobilizing the Army. They didn't have a plan for how are we going to stabilize Tennessee. Yeah.
Two little points of information and then my question. First, Charles Gunther, who built Libby Prison in Chicago, was actually in service of the Confederacy during the war, got captured, and then ended up in Chicago. Just a little tiny.
Well, anyway, go ahead.
Trust me on this one. I actually double checked it before I said it. Okay. Number two, they actually did have a plan for pacifying the Confederacy. The Provost Marshal's office, largely staffed by the Veteran Reserve Corps, was supposed to spread out across the South. Many of the guys did, but they were just kind of understaffed and sometimes co-opted by their friends in the Confederacy. So there was actually a plan there. But what I really wanted to hear more about was, so how did you find this this archive of the escapees? Record groups are harder to get physical contact with ever since the Borg of Ancestry.com prevented all of us from getting at the documents.
Exactly. So there's 3 registers of prisoners that have escaped, okay? 2 of them were where they were supposed to be, but what happened was one of them got filed with the records of the Sultana disaster. So I had gone with the record group number to the archivist and said, I'm looking for this, and we ended up with the Sultana records, and then in there was this register, which should have been filed with the other register of prisoners that escaped. So there's 3 different registers that I've kind of combined and compared the names on it. So that's how it happened. It was in with the Sultana disaster records. And the Sultana disaster, some of the prisoners that were held in Cahaba prison in Alabama, they're taken to Vicksburg, and the U.S. officials in charge load a bunch of them on a ship that couldn't handle that load and that had some weaknesses, and the ship sinks in the Mississippi River. And I can't remember exactly how many people it kills. It's like 2,500 or something. It's still the worst maritime disaster in American history. But I mean, it's this tragic thing that these guys survived their time in prison camp and then die in a terrible riverboat accident. So that's the Sultana disaster, and that's where I found this register.
Well, I think that's all the time we have tonight, so
Thank you.
please join me in thanking. As one last thing, we have a book to give away, originally written by Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge in 1895. This is Hero Tales from American History, and mostly popular readership in the 20th century, but a few years ago the McConnell Center re-released it with an introduction by Senator McConnell and Dr. Gary Gregg. So tonight we're giving away an autographed copy of it, and Dr. Foote, would you do the honors of shipping out a name?
Okay, Austin Shipley.
Come on. So thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for coming. Please join us on the 20th of October for a lecture on the end of the war of 1812. And all the teachers, scholars need to head up to the McConnell Center.